Good morning.
So, let's pick up on that. Where do we go from here? How significant a meeting is this, given that it seems that Europe is being sidelined to an extent?
Yes, it's very important that Europe stays on Ukraine's side. The Europeans' own security, so the rest of us in Europe, depends on Ukraine coming out of this war, which was, of course, started by Russia invading Ukraine in 2014 and then the full-scale invasion in 2022, that it comes out of this war as a sovereign nation able to prosper and be secure. If that doesn't happen, then the entire structure of European security is in danger. So what President Trump has been doing looks a bit like trying to come to a peace deal at almost any price, rewarding Russia for its invasion, even though I'm sure President Trump wouldn't see it that way. And what the Europeans need to do is to find a way to support Ukraine so that Russia can't advance further, and to somehow come to a deal with the Americans to prevent American support being taken away from Ukraine.
So do you have any sense of where we are with negotiations more broadly, whether a deal can be struck that will be palatable to both Ukraine and Russia? It seems very difficult to square that circle.
It's hard to know what the current proposal is from the US side, or is it the US-Russian side? But what we have seen most recently with the 28-point plan that was produced by Steve Witkoff, President Trump's envoy, and Kirill Dmitriev, President Putin's national investment advisor, looked like effectively taking away Ukrainian sovereignty and giving a lot of territory that hadn't yet even been won by Russia on the ground to Russia. If the deal that is on the table at the moment, that apparently President Zelensky still needs to look at, is anything like that, then it's hard to see how Ukraine survives in the medium to longer term. So if we're faced with that kind of situation, and if President Trump is behind that, then it is indeed, as you say, very hard to see how you square it. So I think a lot of persuasive work needs to be done by Keir Starmer, President Macron, Friedrich Merz, to get the team around President Trump and President Trump himself, there's a very narrow team of a few people, to see that problem and to recognize the US self-interest in peace and security in Europe.
But as Catherine was saying at the top there, it does seem that the White House is drifting more towards Moscow position. We had the country's latest national security strategy published just a few days ago, which was very critical of Europe, saying it faced civilizational erasure, whilst on the other hand, it didn't cast Russia as a threat to the US. It's a remarkable turnaround and state of affairs.
To my eye, that national security strategy, it's a 27-page document, which, for a national security strategy actually is very, very short. If you read it, anybody reading it will see that it's really quite superficial in what it says, and it devotes about a couple of pages to Europe with those sorts of that sort of terminology that you've just mentioned in it. To my eye, that national security strategy doesn't support the US national interest. Now, here I am sitting in Europe telling Americans what their national interest is. But Americans have, for the last 80 years at least, understood that security in Europe with strong US leadership alongside key European powers is central to US national security. The worry is that point is disappearing in the American approach. And on the Russian side, the Russians under President Putin, their approach is that there is no, what they say in public is one thing, but in private their approach is that there is no form of peace which benefits them other than continued Russian advances further west. And I think that's the thing that we all need to understand, and that'll be heavily on the agenda at the meeting today with President Zelensky.
And Ukraine itself, in a bit of a bind at the moment, Zelensky's administration rocked by accusations of corruption. The fighting isn't going their way on the ground either. Zelensky is in a difficult position and under increasing pressure to accept a peace deal.
He's under pressure from President Trump. As far as President Putin is concerned, I think what he wants is President Zelensky to take the blame for the deal failing, because President Putin doesn't really want the deal. He wants to be able to carry on fighting, even though he is in serious trouble because he's achieving very, very small gains for huge losses. But you're right that President Zelensky is suffering, of course, a lot of attacks, a lot of missile attacks and so on, hitting national infrastructure such as power supplies going into winter. And he's had this corruption scandal. On the other hand, he's dealt fairly decisively with the corruption scandal, and maybe he can come out of that politically in Ukraine quite well.
We shall see what comes of today's meeting between Zelensky, French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz in Downing Street, of course, with the Prime Minister. We'll see what comes of it later today. Thank you so much for joining us. That is Andrew Levy, who used to be a senior British diplomat in Moscow, amongst other places. It is coming up to 8:15.
Yeah.